Hi guys, I'm Philip J. Watt and this is the Conscious Society YouTube channel. Today we've got a very interesting guest. As you know, if you've been following my channel, I've been trying to tell a new story, to provide the real narratives on life in various different areas. And this particular area is vitally important that we uncover the truth around, because it involves the deaths of soldiers, civilians. It is a life and death scenario. It is a future of humanity scenario. So as you may be able to speculate, it is on the circumstances of Middle East, the war on terror, and any associating implications. The guest is Tim Anderson, Professor Tim Anderson. He is a senior lecturer at the Sydney University. He is a writer and activist. He's written in various journals. He's got a couple of books, a few books actually, but there's two that I want to focus on here today. The first one is Land and Livelihoods in Papua New Guinea, and his latest, written in January this year, or published in January this year, is The Dirty War on Syria. So welcome to the program, Tim.
Thanks, Phil.
Now, as I mentioned before, this is a pretty serious topic because we have been led to believe certain things in the media around what is the facts and the fiction of what is happening on the global stage in terms of the Middle East. And that is something that, we'll really unpack a little bit later. But before we get to that, let's start with Land and Livelihoods in Papua New Guinea, and really what's happening over there. What sort of inspired you to write that particular book?
I had a long relationship with Papua New Guinea. I was there when I was young, and I was asked to go and do a report on forestry about 14 years ago. And I said to the people, I need to go and talk to people about what their priorities are. So I spent some time from 2003 onwards looking at the concerns for local people mainly. And I found that land was at the centre of all of it. And over the years, I started to write and engage with some of the campaigns that were involved there, do some research on small farmers, and particularly people in rural areas, because most people in Papua New Guinea live in rural areas and get their living out of the land, their customary land. And it's quite a distinct type of history there in terms of how families have held on to customary land. And the confrontations that those families had had with logging companies, with big monoculture, agribusiness, and so on. So the end result was that book on Land and Livelihoods in Papua New Guinea, and it's mainly about the economic possibilities for small rural families farming their own land. What are the best economic possibilities for them? And so it comes into confrontation with some of the big corporate agendas, and in particular the move to try and commercialise land and take it out of that traditional tenure system that they've had for many thousands of years.
Well, one of the biggest mass migrations, and probably the biggest mass migration in human history, is moving the Chinese rural families and farmers into the cities. So I guess that's probably an approach they're trying to take to get the small farmer into a city setting, into an urban setting, and to take control of the land resources for whatever corporate agenda they've got.
Well, to some extent that's true, and certainly there's been a huge urbanisation in China, and it's affected their agriculture. But the starting point was rather different, wasn't it? The starting point in China, there was very distinct history, long history in China, including the revolution a couple of generations ago now. In Papua New Guinea, what's rather different about land, and different in every country, is that you can't really, it's very hard to generalise about land and agriculture without taking into account the particular history there. And in Papua New Guinea, there was a relatively short colonial period which didn't really upset the land tenure system. So what exists to this day in most of Papua New Guinea, over 90% of the land, is held by communities and by families. So from that starting point, and so it's very different to here in Australia, it's very different to Latin America, it's different to a lot of parts of Asia, although there's customary land in parts of Asia and Africa still. But the Melanesian countries of the Pacific are quite unique in the sense that the oral traditions are recognised by law and families maintain their customary land by law. It's not centrally registered in a database. And the government has to recognise that by law and by constitution. So there isn't quite the same sort of thing going on as in China, where you had a different land tenure system and where there was a huge process of industrialisation in the last few decades, leading to that big migration you mentioned into the cities. There isn't that sort of industry in the cities in Papua New Guinea. There's been a big focus from the government part on minerals and gas and so on, but also on this agribusiness for large monocultures. So what I'm saying is Papua New Guinea has its own distinct history, and we need to recognise that there's something quite distinct about their own history and the way in which livelihoods, more importantly, I use this term livelihoods, the way people look after their families and feed themselves and house themselves and so on, as a way of talking about the economy. And the economy isn't just exports and companies, it's about how families survive and have survived for many, many generations. So that's why the focus on livelihoods in rural Papua New Guinea there.
Yeah, it's the same things happening over in India too. We know a lot of Indian farmers, many are committing suicide because of what's happening in terms of their land and the petrochemical and monocultural agriculture model coming in. But those in the sustainability and regeneration movement, you could probably blanket it as an environmentalist movement, but moving away from that monocultural model, from that petrochemical model, one to a polycultural model, which is again small scale farming or local regional farming to provide all the resources and other sort of materials such as fibre and fuel and whatnot from at that scale. One such example is permaculture, whereas it is used as a alternative to this big industrialisation of our food and other resource systems. So do you talk about that sort of approach in your book?
Yes, there are some shared features, such as you mentioned, and it's been recognised progressively more, or the value of small farming in ecological terms as well as economic terms. There's a concept that some analysts have used in recent years called the multifunctionality of small farming. That is to say, small farming and traditional farming has been downvalued. The value hasn't been recognised because of the great focus on export income and the formal sector, basically. So the idea of the multifunctionality of small farming says that we haven't been counting the informal markets, we haven't been counting the subsistence, we haven't been counting the cultural reproduction, the ecological protection, the ecological stabilisation of small farming compared to big monocultures. We haven't been counting the social security value and the food security value of small farming. So those sorts of factors, particularly since the global food crisis in 2008, when the prices of food went up drastically, and food in a sense has become more of a superior economic good in economic terms in recent times. In the past, it wasn't recognised as much, and all young people wanted to get out of rural areas and go to the cities. I think it was about 10, 15 years ago when most people on Earth now live in cities. Up until 10 or 15 years ago, most people on Earth lived in rural areas. But so there hasn't been a good image, I suppose, for the future for people in small farming communities. But that's changed to some extent, and there's a counter movement in a number of countries, and it is to do with, as you say, partly the environmental implications, but also the economic implications, that people realise that there is greater value, that employment creation, a whole range of things associated with small farming. A small amount of land is tremendously productive, and you can't really measure, I'm one of the people that's tried to do it, you can't really measure the economic value of, say, a hectare or half a hectare of land. You can feed people for centuries, for millennia, from half a hectare of land if it's looked after properly. You can calculate its productive output in a year, but you can't calculate its value. So that's the problem when people try to sell land where land hasn't been sold before. There's an enormous problem in terms of future value, in terms of intergenerational equity, And this is one of the factors behind traditional systems, whether it's in Africa or the Pacific or in Asia, that they think about the people they're dispossessing into the future in terms of commercialising land. We don't understand that so much in our society because the land, the indigenous people in Australia were dispossessed en masse, more or less, and there's been a movement to try and reclaim that in recent decades. But we take for granted to some extent still the idea that you can commercialise a little package of land and sell it off and not really recognise the value of that land into the future.
Yeah, that's right. It's not just economic either, is it? And we really do need to go back to relocalisation and re-regionalisation in our food supply, not just for food security, but also because just the nutritional content. We need to start looking at how to vitalise the food that we do eat, because the petrochemical model, industrial agricultural model has decreased nutrients. It's caused desertification, deforestation, soil erosion, the death of the life of the soil or the soil food web. There's all these implications that you're sort of referring to in terms of value, that capital that we can get from really treating our sort of farming in a more respectable, localized way. Now, in terms of your going back to your book, did you, in it, because I haven't read it, so I just read a quick synopsis of it, but did you refer to the West Papuan sort of scenario in terms of the genocide of about 500,000 West Papuans since the 1960s?
Not in that book. It's true, of course, that the West Papuans are culturally cousins, neighbours to people in Papua New Guinea. They share that tremendous cultural diversity and language diversity. On the island of Papua New Guinea, there's around 1,000 languages. That's as many, almost as many as in Africa, which is a much bigger continent. But of course, as you know, historically things have been very different. In Papua New Guinea, the land tenure wasn't destroyed by colonialisation, and it remains, despite a lot of controversies, more or less intact today. In West Papua, you've got a very strong state that didn't recognise traditional tenure and a strong army that could eject people from their land for agribusiness, again, the same sort of agribusiness as in Papua New Guinea. In Papua New Guinea, you've got a weak state, a weak army, and you've got a genuinely independent law, which, despite all of the scams to do with land, does recognise people's legal rights when it comes to it. So there's quite a different circumstance in dealing with these sorts of forces in West Papua. So my book was mainly about the options for small rural families in dealing with these new economic possibilities and trying to shed some light on, from my economic background, shed some light for those families on what the best options were. Basically, they were being made a lot of promises about great benefits from participating in large agribusiness schemes, which came in as a backfill to the forestry, the logging industry, which has got its own problems in history. So I wasn't really looking at West Papua because the context is quite different there. It comes from the same sort of cultural roots, but the context is very different.
Yeah, so given they've got, I think, the largest gold mine in the world and a ton of natural resources, it doesn't matter where we're talking, the corporatocracy is really infiltrating our world, and even here in Australia, it really does control policy decisions, policy direction, the lobbyist army and the big money involved in the political duopoly that we have here. Really needs to be woken and shaken into a new regime that reflects the will and needs of the people and the environment, including our farmers and including our food systems. All right, look, we'll get into the Middle East, your new book, The Dirty War in Syria. Let's start with a bit of a snapshot of why you wrote this book.
Yeah, I have followed, wars with horror through my life, basically. I grew up during the Vietnam War and the lies that are told to us during those wars. And what really shocked me about the war on Syria is that the people in this country, in Australia, didn't really recognise it as a war by the same powers against an independent state. Even though over the last 15 years we've had a series of wars under the name that you mentioned, the War on Terror, They've been involved pretty much in an attempt to have a clean sweep across the region. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria. Iran was on the agenda, but it's been put on the back burner. All of those countries across the Middle East that had some degree of independence have been progressively wiped out. But because the war on Syria was, and still is to a fair degree, portrayed as a civil war or some sort of insurrection by people against a dictator and the need for humanitarian intervention, somehow or other our population swallowed this, you know. And I'd heard it before with my experience in Latin America, the history of dirty wars, the history of false pretexts and proxy armies. And so I decided to investigate Syria after, you know, the destruction of Libya in that same year, and investigate some of the roots of it and what it was about, and to study, because I didn't really have a great depth of knowledge about Syria at that time, to study what was going on in that country. And the end result was this book, basically, which got published earlier this year, which has two functions. One, to talk about the nature of this war and the continuity in the bigger context of the agenda of the big powers in the Middle East, and two, to dispel many of the myths that were built up around this war. So that's really why I came to it.
You mentioned the series of countries in the Middle East that we've been involved in, you know, from a Western perspective. And I think it was General Wesley Clark who sort of went on, I think it was Democracy Now! And with Amy Goodman, and exposed that there was an elitist or a corporate agenda to infiltrate these countries for whatever reason, and that's something we might be able to discuss now. And they have been systemically doing exactly what you said, taking these countries back into the power of these corporate imperialistic sort of Western control. So when you do research around this area, is 9/11 something that comes into this equation?
It is, but I tend to avoid it because it's flooded with a lot of discussion and theories these days, and I decided to focus specifically on this war because it seemed to be particularly misunderstood, and it's the big current war of our day, really. Of course, you have to recognise that this plan begins either before or after 9/11, depending which way you look at it. But what Wesley Clark was referring to was a plan of aggression, a plan of aggressive war to take over 7 countries in 5 years, he said. Well, he was told about that plan in the Pentagon when he was visiting. He was formerly head of Nato, Wesley Clark, and he was told about this plan at the time when the invasion of Afghanistan was being prepared or launched. So that really, of course, if you looked at the history of Syria, you could go back to the 1950s. There were CIA interventions in the 50s there. There was an attempt to generate an opposition which the US could use to overthrow the government led by the father of the current president, Hafez al-Assad, back in 1980. There's documents that have been declassified since then. They were wary of it back in 1980 because the Soviet Union was always the partner of Syria. These days, Russia is still the partner of Syria. So they were wary of it. There was no particular opposition the US had back then. But there is a longer history to this, Phil, and it goes to the rise of Arab nationalism after the Second World War in particular, and the use of Islamist groups against that Arab nationalism to try and divide the Arab nations and keep them weak. This had always been a tactic of empires, and the US learned it from the British, and the British learned it from the Romans, for example, that you can't control big populations unless you know how to divide them. So, of course, the history of the British Empire was to, after the mid-19th century, was to try and divide their former colonial possessions. They induced the Indians into partitioning India into Pakistan and eventually Bangladesh. They got the Irish to divide Ireland. They divided Palestine, as we know. So there was a history of that. when the US took this over in the 1950s from the British, when the US became the big power in the world, they inherited not just Israel, but also Saudi Arabia. And President Eisenhower back in the mid-50s said at the time that he wanted to use the Saudi king and the vicious sectarian perversion of Islam, really, that the Saudis had, to try and make the Saudi king a figure in competition with Egypt's Nasser. At the time, Nasser was the hero of the Arab world. He defeated the British and the French over the Suez Canal because the US wouldn't back them up. And so Arab nationalism was on the rise, and the US was trying to contain that to control the region. Of course, they backed a coup in Iran, reinstalled the Shah in Iran. It took another 25 years before the Shah was overthrown by what became the Islamic Republic in Iran. So looking at the big powers, there was always a modus operandi of empires, which was to control entire regions, to exclude their perceived competitors, whether they were really competitors for another empire or not, but in any case, any other big powers, in particular these days, Russia and China. Also, the fear of the US is an independent Europe, let's remember, an independent Europe which would develop a peaceful, productive relationship with Russia, for example. That's the big dilemma going on in Europe, and particularly Central Europe these days. Why is Germany and the Central European countries being drawn into an aggressive plan against Russia when they could have good relationships with Russia, for example? So empires had always tried to control entire regions, exclude their competitors, and use divisive forces in those regions to try and stop the people coming together. At the same time, we've seen a parallel development in Latin America where, led by the late Hugo Chavez, the Latin Americans had put together a number of strong regional organisations, the CELAC, UNASUR, the ALBA, to try and stabilise and take control of their regions against the big powers. So these are big historical shifts, and the recent one of the US trying to do a clean sweep across the region, it's hit a rock in the name of Syria at the moment, and Syria has coalesced a lot of its allies around it now. Iran, Hezbollah, Iraq is moving steadily but surely into the Syrian camp there too. Russia has come in, as we all know, only some months ago. So there's a big game going on. It used to be called the Great Game when there was the rivalry between the British Empire and the Russian empires, for example, or the Austro-Hungarian empires. Then the Great Game became the Cold War. The Great Game, again, these days is the US and its allies pushing an expansionary Nato in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East. And they, of course, overran Afghanistan, they overran Iraq, but they haven't won the hearts and minds of the Iraqis. In Iraq, you've got most of the young people there see the US as their main enemy. These Western polls are showing this now. They destroyed little Libya, and they tried to do the same with Syria, and they're having a very hard game with it at the moment. Of course, it's still very dangerous, but as I said, Syria, there's been a coalescence of forces in Syria to resist that push, and that's the big war of our day. And I think it's very poorly understood in Western countries.
So there is a historic context, and I guess there's oil and gas pipelines that get involved. There might be secondary benefits. There's allegations around installing the Zionist central banking system is one other approach to the Rothschilds and whatnot. But then there's also, I guess, a process of going forward through the New World Order paradigm, or the One World Government paradigm. So do you see this as like a unionising of the Middle East, getting Sunni control over the Shiites, unionising the Middle East and being able to incorporate that into, the bigger goal of that One World Government?
Well, these are all perspectives which people use to understand. To me, the logic of empires is the best way to understand it, really, because the world, despite the collapse of the Soviet Union and that block of countries some generation ago, there isn't a unipolar world. There isn't really the US is certainly the single superpower, but there are other forces in the world, as we know. East Asia, Russia, the Europeans have their own dynamics. Latin America's created its own pole of power. What's been spoken of in recent times is a shift from a unipolar world, or an attempt to have a unipolar world where, as it seemed in the 90s, the US and its allies, its European allies largely dominated the UN and the Security Council. But the idea of a multipolar world, a shift towards a multipolar world where there is not a single power that dominates the world, is an idea that's been pushed in Latin America, in Russia, to some extent in China, to some extent in other parts of the world. So that, I think that logic of empires and the shift, the reaction to empires. Remember, after all, the whole colonial area was formed as a reaction to colonialism, which was a major tactic of the empires of that time. Both of the world wars of the last century were about the competition between empires, the dismantling of empires. And so I know some people have this fear of the United Nations. The United Nations is really just a reflection of the power relations that exist in other power blocks, really. But to me, the logic of empires helps us understand better what's going on. And as you said, the question of gas pipelines, the question of control of oil and gas resources are very important elements under that, but I think they are elements under that. There is a strategy at work, and the strategy is, as you saw from, as you mentioned in the Wesley Clark insight into that thinking in the Pentagon of the idea of taking over 7 countries in 5 years. But there's written doctrine on this too. The doctrine that there's one book that's called Destroying Disconnectedness, Globalization or Globalism, which destroys disconnectedness. The idea that independent nations in themselves are threats to an integrated global system. Or there's another Pentagon doctrine which is about full spectrum dominance, which is, this is not an abstract thing, it's coming from Washington. It's because although the US is no longer the big economic power in the world that it was, it persists with these plans for what used to be called wars of aggression. They call regime change these days. And really that sort of ambition is causing havoc in the world today. They pretend that it's someone else's problem. It's a civil war. They'll come in as a mediator and resolve things, through peace talks. But in reality, the big sticking point has been these very aggressive agendas, demanding that governments be overthrown, demanding that, Assad must go, or Gaddafi must go, or whoever it is. That's the root cause, to me, of the aggravation in the world today. And for all of the faults of the United Nations, the principle of a community of sovereign nations, a cooperative sovereign nations, still has a lot going for it. International law has some purpose still these days, despite those sorts of attempts to undermine it.
The multilateral approach, I think, is the only one that's going to work. We talked about, the imperialistic empire of the United States, and when we consider something like that, we need to look at how the dollar is going, the death of the dollar, the death of the petrodollar, the 30, 40, multi-decade relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States has been very beneficial for both parties up until very recently. There seems to be a bit of a split, a divide between those two stakeholders, and we'll see how that unfolds over time. But look, let's hone in on this media propaganda, or the disinformation, the misinformation that you believe that has been put forward to undertake regime change, as you put it, because what does regime change really mean? What does it mean from a practical standpoint, and what are who are the true beneficiaries of it?
Well, regime change backed by military force is what used to be called a war of aggression, the supreme crime, the root cause of all other crimes, war crimes and crimes against humanity. The wars of aggression were the Nuremberg Tribunal said were the supreme crime that allowed the possibility of these other crimes, genocide, crimes of humanity, war crimes. So the problem with that approach of course, that is totally illegal in today's international system. Since 1945, the idea of intervening to overthrow a sovereign state is illegal. So other methods have to be developed to pursue it. And some of those methods are very unpalatable because most people in the world don't support war. No country, I think hardly any country supports wars of aggression against other countries. So the pretexts are created, and there have always been pretexts for wars, even back in ancient times with the Romans, or the colonial system, the civilizing missions. The type of direct invasion that was carried out in Afghanistan and Iraq were unpalatable to large sections of Western populations. The dirty wars against Libya and Syria, using proxy armies, Islamist armies, that is to say, fundamentalists, well, the type of fundamentalism that it's called Wahhabism or Salafism in the Middle East and has been cultivated by the big powers for decades. Those sorts of things hide behind a pretext of a humanitarian war. Or nowadays we've got this, the idea of protective intervention, that the Western powers are somehow fighting those proxy armies that they themselves created. So the duplicity in this type of war narrative is extremely profound and affects people. It's hard for people to get away from it. There were those debates about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, but that was a relatively simple falsehood that was shown up. The persistent idea that the 5-year-long war on Syria is a civil war and it's to do with overthrowing a dictatorship is incredibly persistent, even though there's a huge amount of evidence on it. At this stage, there was much less evidence on it 5 years ago, and that's why those of us that were investigating 5 years ago had to make a greater effort. But if you look today, every element in my book, for example, you can justify by admissions from the US and the Western powers themselves. This was the extraordinary thing is, for example, 2 years ago, 3 senior US officials, the Vice President, the head of the US Armed Forces, the head of the Congress Armed Forces Committee, admitted that their allies were financing and arming all of the extremist groups in Syria, all of them, and Iraq, particularly in Syria. And yet the Western media persists with this idea that the West is supporting moderate rebels to fight the extremists, and the West is in some game against the extreme groups like Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS, the various al-Qaeda, the new flavours of al-Qaeda that have been created in recent times, basically. But even though those officials admitted, even though Wesley Clark put out that Pentagon theme of 7 countries in 5 years, even though those many other elements of evidence. In 2012, for example, a US intelligence report from 2012 was leaked in 2014. It said that the creation of an Islamic state in eastern Syria was exactly what the US and its allies wanted, to weaken the government in Damascus. All of these things, because of course Western people have great trouble in reading the media in other countries. Really, this is a problem that we have culturally, that people will say to you, oh, you can't read the Russian media, you can't read the Syrian media, you can't read the Iranian media, you can't read the Latin American media, and they come back to their own sources, and they're more comfortable, we are more comfortable with their own sources, but they are still saying this is a civil war, it's about people rising up against a dictatorship. The US is fighting these extremist terrorist groups. Years after, those same officials, the sources from the US government, have admitted that no, they want the extremist groups to divide the country so that they can weaken the independent governments in that region. So it's an extraordinary situation that, and people are intimidated to say something different, to say that the emperor has no clothes. People don't want to say the emperor has no clothes. That's the sort of cultural environment we live in today in Western countries. And it's something about our own integrity as people that we can talk honestly about things, that we do engage with the better sides, I say in the book, the better sides of Western culture. That is to say, some basic ethics about dealing with people in other countries, some basic ethics about recognising evidence, looking for independent evidence, not using partisan sources or sources that have inherent conflicts of interest about these sorts of things. Some of those basic things we can rescue from our own culture. It's for our own integrity, as well as the people in other countries that are being devastated by these wars.
I 100% agree. The media, mainstream media, the corporate media has been exposed as a propaganda tool for a long time now. Anybody who takes that shit seriously needs to have one good, long, hard think about where they receive their news, because those official narratives have been blown apart by independent journalism and whistleblowers and a whole variety of evidence which suggests around this particular area and many, many others that the truth has not been the truth has been omitted, or a particular idea or concept or narrative is being pushed for certain agendas. Now, just to recap for my audience, Tim was talking about the proxy armies, so Al-Qaeda, ISIS and others who were funded and somewhat created and funded and amplified and managed by not just some of the Middle Eastern states such as Saudi Arabia and also Mossad in Israel, but also by the Western powers, including CIA and other government agencies who have been using those armies as tools to achieve their agenda, i.e. take out Assad, take out Gaddafi and others. So what sort of evidence is there to back up that claim? Because that is a really, really, I guess, confronting, controversial concept that Western governments were funding terrorists, that the war on terror is created by Western powers. So that's such a huge claim. And everybody, most people want the end of the war. They don't want terrorism. They don't want this continued divide. So how can you convince somebody who's not really aware of this sort of information that it is true?
I say let's recover our own better traditions in ethical treatment of other peoples, listening to other peoples. Let's look for independent evidence on these sorts of issues. You're right, it's a difficult thing for people to accept because it's one of the foundational myths of Western foreign policy these days, that they are involved in some great struggle against extremist groups in the Middle East, where there has been indeed a blowback, of terrorism to Europe in particular. It hasn't happened to the US, not in recent years, but, there's been a number of incidents in European countries of terrorism from people that have often come from Europe, gone to Syria or Iraq and gone back to Europe. So this issue is a very pertinent one for the Europeans in particular, but also for us. So the fact is there's a huge amount of evidence, but it's not being run in the Western media. You can find it there. It is in the Western media, but it's really given lower prominence. As I said, there's this extraordinary contradiction between the general line, the general narrative about the war in Syria and the admissions that are made by Western officials. I just mentioned to you 3 of the most senior US officials admit that their close allies, in particular Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, also some of the other Gulf monarchies, were giving arms and weapons to all of those extremist groups, from some of the ones they're trying to protect still, Al-Sham, Jaish al-Islam, for example, the big ones that have always worked with the internationally banned group Jabhat al-Nusra, the official al-Qaeda franchise in Syria. And at times they've also worked with ISIS, which is the split-off from al-Qaeda, which was created in Iraq 10 years ago, also to divide and weaken Iraq, and in particular to try and stop the new Iraqi government in Baghdad developing a friendly relationship with Iran. That was one of the things the US didn't want. So there's a large amount of evidence on this. Chapter 12 in my book, The Dirty War on Syria, is specifically dedicated to that proposition, saying let's not conclude anything until we look through the evidence. Don't accept anyone's conspiracy theory. Have a look at the evidence, go through it systematically, and even if you don't want to accept the evidence from the Iraqis, what the Iraqis say, the Iraqi officials and military people say, and they have been saying it for a couple of years, that the US and the UK have been providing direct assistance to ISIS in Iraq. Even if you don't want to accept what the Syrians say, have a look what is being admitted from US sources and from leaked intelligence documents. It's their intelligence document, I'll remind you again, 2012, it's exactly what the Western powers supporting the so-called Syrian opposition, I mean the armed opposition, wants, is to create an Islamic state in eastern Syria to weaken Damascus. That's the words from an August 2012 US intelligence document. So there's a large stock of evidence there. If people are prepared to, curious, honest people are prepared to look at that evidence, they can read chapter 12 of my book on that particular issue. And yeah, don't accept my word for it. Don't accept anyone's conspiracy theory. Let's have an honest look at the evidence rather than being fooled by the messages that are beamed out every day by the Western media. It shocked me, really, the control that government lines have on the corporate media. It's a great indictment of the corporate media that we do not have independent reporting, questioning, looking at this evidence, thinking what this evidence means, and really just falling into lockstep with the Washington line. In Australia, of course, we know, unfortunately, and many political leaders in other countries will say, you don't have to tell us about Australia because we know that you don't really have an independent foreign policy to the US in these sorts of issues. Okay, maybe in the region, the Pacific, there's a certain amount of independence there, but in the Middle East, there is not, and there has never been really an independent policy, Australian policy there. So, you know, it's a little demoralising and depressing, but that's what a number of, if you talk to government ministers in the Middle East or in the Pacific or in Latin America, for example, I remember, you know, they've got some funny expressions for it. They don't take us seriously because we don't have an independent policy. But why not have an honest discussion is what I say. Why not have a look at the evidence independently to reaffirm our own integrity as human beings with an honest discussion amongst ourselves, not shouting down other people, looking at the evidence. What's wrong with that?
Yes, I think a transparent dialogue around all these issues and more is absolutely vital. I think we've lost a lot of our integrity, as you mentioned. The Australian government a lapdog of US imperialism and beyond. Our media sold out, so all over the world. It's just, you cannot, the free media does not exist unless you look at independent and alternative journalism and media, such as, for example, Zero Hedge and many others who are trying to expose this sort of stuff. But it really is important that we start to acknowledge this sort of stuff. This is real. We are not dealing with the truth when it comes to official and mainstream narratives. It is clear as day. And once we start sort of accepting that as a collective, we can get on and start putting it back into action. Some of those virtues. Start reinstalling our virtues on life that we should have not let slip. We should not let have been our sort of policy direction and our operations and our general governance being taken over by things that are out of line with the basic humanity structure that we need. So look, that's my
I call it integrity, and I think another expression I like is that we have to discover our authentic voice, basically, to speak in our own genuine voice and not try and pretend to be someone else or try and please some other narrative. But one of the good things about Australian culture that I like is that we have this capacity to be direct and frank without being rude or abusive, but we can be direct and frank and honest. But it's very difficult to do that with the type of corporate media that we have. Even though we have a lot of resources in terms of independent media on the internet, that corporate media is still having a very powerful, depressing effect on people's voices, genuine, authentic voices, I think.
We need to stand up for the truth. The truth is above all. And we need to have that respect for the truth and respect for our own capacity to be self-determining as an individual and as a nation. And that is something that we have lost and we need to reinstitute. And I don't see any problem or fear around dealing with these issues in a truthful and in integral, respectful manner. Now, I just want to quickly move back to Russia for a moment, and you talked about the basic expansion of ISIS. One of the things that I find quite damning and exposing is that we have tried to get rid of ISIS supposedly for a good year or so before the Russians stepped in. But then Russia came in and they have made considerable progress in stopping that expansion of ISIS and actually wiped some of them out. There was reports of them needing to raise funds to get their money because the oil supply was cut off from Turkey. Apparently, Turkey was training and nursing some of the wounded ISIS personnel, as well as selling their oil on the black market to places like Israel. And this is also all information that Russia did expose to the world, and they even released photographs of all these trucks lined up all the oil trucks going to Turkey. So do you think that's another really important reflection on how this war on terror has been a sponsored process to achieve the agenda of the imperialistic process?
Yes, it's clearly now you see that there's a great constellation of forces lining up around Syria. And also there's a big NATO build-up in Eastern Europe against Russia at the same time. Let's not forget that. Russia has its own interests. It says, the leadership in Russia says that they want to resume their position as a great power without being an empire. I tend to believe them at this stage because they don't, they're defending their territory, they're defending populations in some cases, as in Crimea, who are essentially Russian. They're defending their allies, and they're in Syria principally, in terms of what the Russian people support the government doing, is that they are there also to defend their ally, but also to stop the terrorism in Syria passing into southern Russia, because they've had their own experience of Islamist terrorism backed by Saudi Arabia in the Chechen war in the 90s, for example. So there's a whole constellation of forces there, and the aggressor in this case is undoubtedly NATO. NATO is trying to make those inroads there. And in reaction to that, there's a counter coalition being created, basically, with internal disturbances in a lot of the European states too are not very happy about NATO being used for those sorts of expansionary purposes. So there's a big game going on there at the moment. And unfortunately, of course, with those sorts of games, if there isn't some basic respect there, then a lot of ordinary people are getting trampled there, basically. And that's the very sad thing. What's sad with Syria, for example, to me, is that people, well-educated people in my society, in our society, don't even recognise that it's a war of aggression. They don't even see that. What's happened to our education system? I'm an educator. How can I accept there's 3 or 4 times as many people with university degrees this day as when I left school, and people are fooled, they're taken in by these sorts of narratives, So it's really important we develop those genuine, honest discussions with people's authentic voices and not be shouted down by the corporate media and censored, basically. I've been black banned from the Australian corporate media. I had my book published in Canada. I get interviewed all around the world now, but in Australia, there's a real clear demarcation. Because there's a current war going on, because the government is committed to it, even though minimally committed, but in ideological terms, the Australian government, be it Labor or Conservative, is committed to this sort of war. We are in straitjackets, more or less, in terms of public discussion. There are very strong pressures against the public discussion. For example, I was invited to Greece to a conference on refugees next month. I'm going. And they invited me as a keynote speaker because I was one of the few people that was investigating the war and the links between the refugee crisis that Europe has and the war. And there was a campaign against that conference to get me removed from the keynote speakers there. And they succeeded to a certain degree, although I'm still presenting at that conference. So there are always these sorts of pressures to try and shut down voices in the European countries, in the NATO countries, in the Western countries that are trying to maintain this line about the war that's going on at the moment, to try and bury a real, genuine, honest discussion about these things.
It's an absolute embarrassment. People think that journalism is free, that media is free, and it just isn't. And the Australian people in particular, if you're watching, you need to recognise this fact that the Australian media will not tell the entire truth. You get some little truths here and there, but in general about whatever is going on in reality, or out in the foreign world or in the domestic world, you're not getting the truth. Now, I just want to quickly dispel a myth. Well, at least get your perspective on it. Did Assad use chemical weapons on his own people or not?
No. And one of the chapters in my book is all about that, and all about the independent evidence there. And the evidence to disprove the allegations comes from Syria, from Jordan, but also from the US. Some of the most powerful evidence to disprove it comes from the US. On the other hand, the chemical weapons have been used in Syria and were used in Syria before that famous incident in August 2013, the incident itself and the incident after it, by Islamist groups in Syria. And they were arrested for it in Turkey. They admitted using it in Aleppo just recently. They used it against Kurds in northern Iraq. So there have been chemical weapons used, but there is not one occasion of the Syrian government using it. I've looked at it. I looked at the most famous incident. The evidence was absolutely conclusive that the Syrian government had not used chemical weapons in August 2013. Nevertheless, the Western media keeps, and so you could, people who are curious can look at chapter 9 in my book and see that evidence chapter and verse, for and against. There was some telemetry evidence that the White House suggested, backed up by Human Rights Watch, which, by the way, that US group has been in lockstep with the White House during this particular war. That was destroyed by scientists at MIT in the US. There was other evidence. So despite that evidence, the Western media keeps repeating the lie that Assad had used chemical weapons and had gassed civilians and children. Complete lie. If you want to look at the evidence, chapter 9 in my book.
How many civilians have died since the Middle East occupation began back in 2003?
Oh, the Middle East occupation. Well, you'd have to start with Afghanistan in 2001. It's difficult to say. The figures are not reliable in any of those cases, but we know that more than 200,000 have died in Afghanistan. We know that it's at least 600,000, probably more, in Iraq. We know that in Libya, 10 times more people died after the NATO intervention than before. The evidence now is admitted in conservative US journals that late President Gaddafi never attacked or threatened to attack civilians. All of those stories about him were fabricated. But you've got another perhaps 20 or 30,000 in Libya. In Syria, they're saying between 300 and 400,000 people have died. So we're looking at something approaching 2 million people that have died as a result of these conflicts, only because in each case there was a war of aggression. There were attempts to overthrow the governments of there. Whatever you thought about the Taliban government in Afghanistan, it looks like it's coming back after all these years, after 15 years of war. So what's been achieved there? The same could be said about Iraq. As bad as Saddam Hussein was, and he was a brutal, cruel man, but the Iraqi people are far worse off, and the Iraqi people themselves now see the US as their main enemy. Libya is a disaster. Syria has been damaged seriously, but it's maintained its integrity because Syria, despite all the propaganda to the contrary, is the only genuine pluralist country in the region. It's not a country that's, for one particular racial or religious group. It's genuinely pluralistic country. It's managed to resist because it's got some internal strengths and it's got strong allies. But enormous devastation in Syria. No one knows the exact numbers are there. I will say one thing, that in terms of numbers in Syria, and contrary to another one of these myths about it being a peaceful protesters who armed themselves against the brutal government. The one, in the first year, the United Nations kept statistics for, well, estimates of the casualties in Syria in the first year of war. After that, they didn't. They pulled their representative out and they left Syria. But in the first year of war, their casualties were around 5,000, and more than just a little bit over half than that were security forces. So just a little over half were security forces, according to the UN, drawing on several different sources. So what does that tell us? It wasn't peaceful protesters involved in that first war. There were peaceful protesters involved in the first war, but they weren't the people shooting and killing people. There was an Islamist insurrection in the middle of those political demonstrations in Syria. That's how it began. And the only real independent body count, if you like, in Syria in that first year said that a little bit over half those casualties were security forces. So that tells you something about the peaceful protesters' story in Syria. Huge amount of death, huge amount of suffering, social dislocation, the damage to children of seeing Western-backed fanatics saying, Allahu Akbar, God is great, as someone's throat is being slit or their head's being chopped off in public. What sort of psychological damage does that do to people? What sort of reconstruction, psychological reconstruction as well as physical reconstruction is needed in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Syria? It's tremendous carnage, and we unfortunately have a hand in that. We have a responsibility in that, and that's why I feel compelled to keep talking about it.
So is part of the resistance of having an honest dialogue about this is the fact that it's basic, criminal wars, illegal wars, and general crimes against humanity?
Yes, of course. As I said, what's called regime change, a softer way of talking about the supreme crime of war of aggression these days, is at the root of all of those other things. Even historically, if you go back centuries and millennia, you find that it's always been the big powers that have caused those huge crimes. The crime of genocide, for example. The word genocide was created, in the 1930s and 40s by a Polish Jewish lawyer called Raphael Lemkin. And he wasn't talking about the Holocaust against the Jewish people in the Second World War. He was talking about earlier genocides by big powers, by imperial powers against Christians in most cases, the way he was talking about it. It's always been the big powers that have committed these enormous crimes. And yet in the current era, we've got the big powers presenting themselves as the protectors against these great crimes. Nothing of the sort. History tells us that it's always been the plans to dominate entire regions and ethnically cleanse people from regions, the Palestinian people, for example. It's been those great powers that have been behind those great crimes. And we shouldn't forget that in a time of alleged humanitarian intervention.
Yes, well, we've got a lot of work to do, don't we, to discuss these sorts of issues and put them on the table to look at real peaceful solutions and, I guess, regenerative solutions to what really has gone on over the last 10 or 15 years over in Syria. A couple of other quick questions. Do you see that false flags play a role in any of the stuff that was happening in Europe and elsewhere?
Absolutely. In Europe, I can't say whether those attacks, the terrorist attacks in Europe, in Paris and Belgium, for example, have been false flags or not. They may be a blowback. They may be blowback terrorism. They may be provocations to induce greater European intervention in the region, because the European intervention in the region, I'm talking about Britain, France, for example, has always been in favour of the anti-government groups in Iraq and Syria. But in Syria, it was a major feature of the war in the first few years, the false flag incidents. And I've documented two of the major ones in my book, the Hula massacre, which was carried out by Islamists against mostly government supporters in Hula. The East Ghouta chemical weapons incident. Some of them were exposed by Western journalists and really didn't go much farther. There was one in Daraya. Over 200 people were killed in Daraya. It was the so-called Free Syrian Army groups that had kidnapped people and were looking for a prisoner exchange. They killed those prisoners when that operation failed. There was a massacre in Akrab near Hula in Homs province in Syria at the end of 2012. Lycoms, that was a false flag, but it was exposed by a British journalist, Alex Thompson. So in the corners of Western journalism, some of these stories have come out. But the scene of war in Syria, unfortunately, is littered with false flags. That is to say, killings, massacres, great crimes that were carried out and then blamed on the other side, knowing that the Western governments, the Western media would accept those false stories and promote them to further demonise the enemies, in the case of Syria, the Syrian army, the Syrian government.
There's definitely a history of false flags, and at the moment things are classified, but as time gets unveiled, so will the truth around particular incidents such as Paris and in Brussels. In terms of the Clinton email scandal, I'm not sure if you're aware too much about this, but her private server, I can't believe that somebody like this is even allowed to run for presidency over in America. She's a criminal, a war criminal, and she certainly has been exposed as somebody who is selling favours to corporate interests over in the Middle East. So do you think that email server has anything to do with that?
Well, I did see earlier on that some of her comments about the need to overthrow the Syrian government to help Israel with its campaign against Iran, that was exposed. And I see more recently that there are reports, I don't know how far they're going to go, that it goes deeper into criminality in the US in terms of money laundering. That might have an impact on her candidacy in the US, but I can't say at this stage. It is interesting that people like WikiLeaks have got access to those sorts of things, and we're seeing the internal thinking of the US administration, at least. It's important at a time when these great deceptions are being perpetrated that we do get access to those sorts of sources of intelligence.
And in terms of Russia, China, US, do you think we're going into some sort of World War III in terms of a physical war? I mean, we've obviously got currency wars that have been happening for many years now. In terms of all-out engagement, including potentially nuclear, do you think that is a potential future?
Well, I certainly hope not. I mean, on the economic front, there has been for at least a decade, and particularly since 2008, when the Chinese joined in, what they call a diversification from the US dollar. So the US dollar, which has been propped up arbitrarily by it being world currency for many decades, is declining there because the Chinese are using bilateral swaps and so on, and they're also using the yuan. There's no one currency, in my view, that's going to replace the US dollar. That's part of this discussion about a multipolar world that is aimed at by the Latins, by the Russians, for example. So at that level, there's there's more or less a managed decline in the US dollar. At times it strengthens when there's bad stock market news, for example, but that's happening on the one side. At the other side, on the military side, there is this, what's most dangerous is the NATO build-up in Eastern Europe, really, and Eastern Europe, we could include Syria and Iraq in that arc, because, of course, Turkey, which is one of the major forces against Syria, is a NATO partner, and using that NATO card to try and strengthen its hand on the Turkey-Syrian border, which is the major aggravation of the war in Syria. So that whole build-up from Turkey up through Eastern Europe is very dangerous. Another 10,000 NATO troops are up there, supposedly to send a message to Russia, whatever that means. But that's a source of danger. I certainly hope it doesn't become a greater conflict. No one really wants escalation in this circumstance. I think even the conduct of the Syrian war shows to a degree that none of the parties, except perhaps some of the mad Islamists, want escalation. There has been a management of that sort of conflict. The diplomatic skills of the Russians have been quite astute dealing with the US. After all, they've used the US language of a war on terror to engage in helping the Syrian government and trying to not destroy their relationship with the US. So the importance of them talking is pretty clear there, but there is a nuclear build-up at the same time. It's the same parties who have been responsible for this build-up, basically. Remember the old Soviet Union announced the first strike ability on nuclear weapons, and the US until today have never renounced that. In fact, they've been talking about tactical nuclear weapons more in recent times. Interestingly, it's been pointed out in the presidential campaign there that Donald Trump, as ugly as he is on many issues, has really challenged a lot of this NATO doctrine, including the first strike idea, including the regime change idea. So maybe that's finally getting into the political agenda in the US, that why are they engaged in this expansion of NATO? Why are they obsessively committed to regime change across the Middle East and across Eastern Europe? There are dangers in that, but I hope that human beings essentially see some greater sense and we don't head into that far greater escalated conflict scenario.
Yeah, it really does seem to be about power, consolidation of power and consolidation of resources. And it is great that there are some of those truths being exposed into the mainstream mentality over in America. Now, finally, just coming back home, in terms of politically and economically, what are the implications of all this on our Australian government, what we should be looking at in terms of our economy? We've got some big issues with private debt to GDP ratios and housing bubbles and other things, and just general ideology. How does Australia deal with this sort of information? First, by putting it on the table and discussing it, obviously. What would be our response, Tim?
Well, you've raised a whole lot of issues there. I think what you said is right. We need to have an honest discussion. That's got to be the starting point, isn't it? You can't really develop any sort of independent ideas or integral, genuine ideas unless there's the capacity to have an honest discussion. And that includes an honest discussion about the dependence that we have with the US in its foreign policy and its wars. It includes an honest discussion about privatisations, which is another feature that really never surfaces in the corporate media. The corporate media is absolutely committed to the process of privatisations, which are very unpopular in this country. So we need an honest discussion. We need to talk about these things openly and without being boxed into some preset combination. And that means we have to have independent media. And our best way to do that is through some of our international networks. I believe that there are some international media networks which we can use to strengthen independent voices. So that's got to be the starting point, because otherwise we're trapped, aren't we? We're going to be doing the same thing. We're going to be copying the models that are sold to us by the other big powers until there's a collapse of some sort. We were lucky in a way to escape great economic recession in the way that a lot of Europe's had it, the way that a lot of US has had it. That won't be forever, I imagine. But I mean, funnily enough, I'm thinking of the late Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser, who got a little bit more reasonable in his old age and wrote a book about all of the damaging things of the US relationship. And that was a heresy, of course, and he was jumped on by both parties. The Labor Party can't stomach that, and the Conservatives, of course, can't stomach it. But we have to talk about these difficult issues for the embedded political discussion, I guess. There's a bipartisan consensus on a range of things about war and privatisation, and we have to somehow get past that and start having some more authentic discussions, I think, to be able to go anywhere.
And that includes engaging the Australian people in that dialogue, because we do feel disenfranchised. There is a lack of faith and respect in the Australian government, and because they have really been ineffective employees of the people. That is what it is. This duopoly has not been serving us. It has been serving the corporatocracy and the banking interests and just the general elite power structure. And we really need to start taking back. And most politicians really just don't understand this. Most journalists, most laymen, even academics. That's why I really wanted to speak to you, Tim, because you are across this information. We do need to talk about the truth. We do need to start having authentic, genuine discussions around these issues. Otherwise, it looks like we've got a very dark, dismal future where we're going to be highly disempowered
I think you're right, and the important thing is, I mean, there's a great deal of cynicism in Western countries because our elites have been immovable. There haven't been genuine experiments in social democracy, basically broader democracy, let's say, in Western countries in the way that there has in countries that have had leaders like Nelson Mandela and Hugo Chavez and Ho Chi Minh. We haven't had that sort of experience, so people become cynical. And the problem with cynicism is that it's disempowering. Basically, people are disempowered. They don't feel it's worth engaging. And what you said about participation, I think, is fundamental. People have to get interested in participating in some sort of social discussions about doing things differently, rather than waiting until there's some disaster which forces us to do things differently.
Yes, well, the first step, I believe, is a disassembling of the political parties. We need to dissolve that. We need some electoral reform and to force independent candidates to represent their electorate as well as the true needs of the people and the environment, because the duopoly has just not served us the way it was, I guess, never designed to. It was always designed for this false left-right illusion of choice. And it's been highly effective at making people ignorant, making people apathetic, and making people feeling disempowered and disenfranchised at the political system that we have today.
I think you're right.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on, Tim. This isn't my, definitely not my area of expertise. It's something I'm very interested in and try to do a lot of research about. But I certainly am not up to scratch with a lot of the information, why I found myself a little bit, I guess, stumbling over the information. But, I'm really glad that I engaged in this. It is really important. If we don't start dealing with the truth, as we've talked about, then it's just darkness. That's just how reality works. So before we go, have I missed anything of importance that you think we should talk about?
Well, we could talk for a long time, but I think we covered a lot of ground. So thanks for that, Bill. I appreciate your intelligent questions.
No, my pleasure. And I think we should be able to catch up at a later stage and do another one as new developments arise.
Thanks.
Great, Tim. Thanks for your time. Bye.
Bye.